What prompted me to enlist? Well, at that stage, that was in 1915, there were huge recruiting campaigns. Of course, in those days, there was no conscription. The whole of the men that went to World War I went as volunteers on their own accords. They sent men all over the country trying to explain how things were bad at Gallipoli, and they were getting bad at Gallipoli because it was only in December 1915 that the Anzacs had to walk away from Gallipoli. They had to give it away. You know that part of history. And anyhow, things were looking pretty bad, and there were recruiting campaigns in Spain. They started off in Gilgandra with a handful of men, and they finished up in Sydney with 250 recruits, gathering at towns as they marched down towards Sydney. And there were two or three of those. There was the Wallabies, the Cooeys, and I think about 3 lots altogether marched into Sydney like that. And they just enlisted as a main body marching in from the countryside. There was only my brother and I, and he wanted to go and I wanted to go, volunteer. Things were bad. Of course, Mother had one child by the second marriage, Vera, and she was about 12 then, I suppose, and Mother didn't have the best of health. So I said to Perce, well, I'll go on the oldest. Oh no, he said, I'll go on the youngest. And now we tossed the penny up, and when it came down, before it came down, he said, what will you call? I said, I'll call heads to win. He tossed the penny up and came down heads. I said, well, there, Perce, that's fair enough. I said, you've got to look after Mum in the meantime, and I enlist. All right, he said. Perce didn't keep his word. He enlisted about, some months after anyhow. We both went away.
I had listened to the Prime Minister and his last man and the last shilling to defend the Empire, and the Premier, New South Wales, and the Archbishop, and I did what they said to do, and I enlisted. They'd started a route march, a recruiting, or a method of recruiting that became fairly popular then. They started a route march from Wagga to Sydney on the 1st of December 1915. And I thought, now this is an opportunity. So without telling my father or anybody, I was sent into Coolamon to get a spare part for the machinery that had broken down on the farm. I suppose it was the reaper and binder. I had to ride a horse 13 miles into town. And I went to the local police station and saw the sergeant there who knew my father very well, Sergeant Cale. He was an Irishman and he wasn't in favour of the war. And I wanted the necessary papers. They called them attestation papers. I wanted these papers, and he said to me, what do you want to go to the war for? Oh, I said, I want to go. He said, are you sure? I said, yes, I am. Well, he said, if that's the case, here's the papers. And he rather reluctantly gave me the papers. So I went over to the doctor then, and all this was done with I was, not very sure of myself because I'd never done any of this sort of thing on the farm. And the doctor said, if you're not 21, he said, have you got your parents' consent? The doctor was greatly in favour of the war, Dr. Duncan Buchanan. I said, no. Well, he said, I can't examine you, he said, until you get your parents' consent. So, of course, that finished that part of the business. So anyway, I went home, I took the papers home, rode home. I had to go back into Coolamon again the next day to get this spare part, and I got my father to sign the papers. I didn't tell my mother.
It was a strange thing. When I got to Sydney, a chap said, any tram you're like Jack with a red on the front will take you past the barracks. Being a hillbilly, I said, okay. And the only tram I could have taken that was wrong was one with a little red triangle, Clavelli. And I was going for a long while. I said to the ticket conductor running on the board, I said, how am I getting close to Victoria Barracks? He said, God, he said. Well, he said, if it's true that the earth is round, you'll be around about 2,000 years. So he at the first stop, he stopped the tram and the driver signalled another tram and took me back, and with a promise that they'd let me off at Taylor Square and direct me, which they did. They're very fine fellows. Well, I got to Victoria Barracks and it was getting late, And when I got up to the desk, the fellow said, "What are you here for?" Because my height was only 5'2½", see? And the big men those days. I said, "I came to enlist." He said, "God blimey," he said, "you're not big enough to pick strawberries." Anyhow, the chap put me through as 5'4¾ and some weight was okay.
I was employed at Bactersea as a clicker, apprentice as a clicker in the boot trade. While I was there, the First War, it was going, Bactersea was on a military parade, big order for military boots. It was all boots then, you know. Even the sailors was boots, no shoes, you see. And it was a military order. They've just completed one, I believe, a big order. From this was the First World War. And as the boys come 21, they finish their time, see. Well, I never come out of my time till September 1916. I come out of my time. Well, there was a crowd, the Snowy River crowd was coming through, and they were en route, and they were through passing Baxters, and everybody went out to see the Snowy River mob, see. And of course, I wasn't finished my time. It was a very important job I was on, you know, and this military order. And I just give me apron that I wore to one of the boys, take it back into the shop, and got me hat and marched up to camp with them. Because I wasn't 21, I never had my parents' consent at the time. But anyhow, I got my parents' consent, see. And lo and behold, being such an important order, I joined the Snowy River Wop, and they marched for miles and miles to Gallipoli. They started way up to Moore or somewhere. Marched for a week, wet and cold, slept out and all the rest. I was down in a feather bed the night before, and I marched into camp, joined the mob. So I got an easy way, but I wasn't there long. They drove me back and made me finish my time. So I had to go to camp. And then when I finished my time, 21, I went away and enlisted. But I missed the mob, the Snowy Rob that I should have been with. The march, Mama was marched a mile, and they marched about 500 miles. I was getting the easy way. I took the credit of being one of the Snowy River mob.
By 1917, recruiting for reinforcements for the AIF were becoming increasingly difficult. Draw was mostly from the young men who were coming on, and the war had already been in operation for 3 full years by this time. So we were really depending on the younger men who were becoming of army service age. In order to intensify the recruiting, the campaigns and various stunts, if you like to call them such, were engaged in. Methods of inducement of men to join up in the army. For instance, throughout Perth, they had a band parading the streets during lunchtime. Hay Street in those days, where the Mall is now, used to be a parade ground for the lunch hour crowds, and it was thickly packed with people spending their lunch hour. So that the band used to be there, sometime marching and sometime just merely standing in order to catch the possible recruit. Meanwhile, recruiting sergeants would go around amongst the crowd there, endeavouring to get their converts. So the Keep the Home Fire Burning was a popular song, and it also had a bit of a jag in it, in as much as the Keep the Home Fire Burning, because there was girls used to go along in amongst the crowd with the white feathers, giving it to the boys who were in civilians. It's a rather mindless and rather cruel thing, because everybody couldn't enlist. A lot of them weren't allowed to enlist, for instance, if they're engaged in what was known as essential services. And there were also family considerations, where perhaps the only son out of a family of 4 stayed behind to look after the family, while perhaps the 3 or 4 brothers were overseas serving. So the white feather business was a very mindless, unthinking sort of a thing, but still it happened. Another arrangement they had was to induce recruits, where they had a horse with a vacant saddle on it. And the recruiting sergeant would induce any young fellow to hop up onto the saddle and ride through the crowds and up to the recruiting centre. where he was duly enlisted.